Dear listeners, welcome to the Cozy Mystery Parlor. It's a quiet pleasure knowing you're spending these moments here with me. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from today? And was your day a gentle one or a busy one? Leave a small note in the comments and remember to subscribe for our daily stories. Now, let's begin.
Chapter 1. The Staircase Everyone Avoided. The train from London arrived late into Roseford, as winter trains so often did, and by the time the taxi turned off the narrow village road and passed through the iron gates of Greyfriar House, daylight had already begun to withdraw. Mrs. Elowen Hartley leaned forward slightly, peering through the window with the attentive curiosity that had long served her better than any notebook. The house rose before her, square, Georgian, and built of pale stone that now looked darker beneath the early dusk. It was the sort of house that had once been confident of its place in the world, and now merely hoped no one would ask too many questions. "Been here before, ma'am?" the driver asked, glancing at her in the mirror. "No," Mrs. Hartley replied pleasantly, "but I understand it has belonged to the Crane family for quite some time." "That it has," he said. "Fine place once. These days, well, things change." Mrs. Hartley smiled, but did not answer. In Roseford, she had learned, people rarely finished such sentences. They preferred to let the listener supply the rest. The taxi stopped before the front steps, and almost immediately the door opened. A woman descended with brisk efficiency, her posture upright despite the tension visible in the set of her shoulders. She wore a deep green dress, well cut, carefully maintained, and unmistakably older than fashion would recommend. "Mrs. Hartley," said the woman warmly, "how good of you to come. I'm Elizabeth Crane." "Thank you for inviting me," Mrs. Hartley replied, accepting her hand. "It's very kind." "Yes, well," Mrs. Crane's smile tightened just briefly. "Any friend of the Bantries is most welcome. Do come inside. It's bitterly cold." A servant appeared to take Mrs. Hartley's modest case, and together they stepped into the entrance hall. Mrs. Hartley paused. The floor was patterned marble, black and white, polished to a dull sheen. The space was imposing, intended to impress, but her eyes were drawn immediately upward, to the staircase that curved elegantly from the far end of the hall. It was a beautiful structure, dark wood, wide steps, a sweeping banister that caught the lamplight, and yet there was something about it that made the air feel heavier. The staircase loomed. "We've decorated for Christmas," Mrs. Crane said, following her gaze, perhaps too enthusiastically. Garlands of holly and ivy wound along the banister, threaded with red ribbon. Candles had been placed carefully at intervals, unlit for now, but ready for evening. "It must be quite an effort to keep it all looking so fresh," Mrs. Hartley said mildly. "Oh, we don't worry about that," Mrs. Crane replied quickly. "It's only for appearances. We won't be using the staircase." Mrs. Hartley turned her head slightly. "Using it?" "It's rather steep," she said, "poorly lit, too. We use the servants' stairs now, much safer. This is decorative." She gestured toward a narrow door to the left. As they walked away, Mrs. Hartley noted something curious. The marble floor bore the marks of frequent passage, except directly in front of the grand staircase. That patch remained strangely untouched, as though people passed around it without quite realizing they were doing so. The servants' stairs were practical and unremarkable. As they climbed, Mrs. Crane filled the silence with talk of guests, meals, and holiday plans, while Mrs. Hartley listened with gentle attentiveness, storing details away where they might later be useful. The house, she observed, was well cared for, but carefully so. Furniture showed signs of age, not neglect. Warmth was present, but rationed. Even comfort seemed measured. When she was finally shown to her room, a fire had been laid, and a small vase of winter flowers placed on the table. "We dine at 8, Mrs. Crane said. "Just family tonight." When she had gone, Mrs. Hartley sat by the window, watching the last of the light fade over the Roseford hedges. In her village, she had learned that houses revealed their secrets not through what they displayed, but through what they avoided. A staircase dressed for celebration, yet never used. A space meant to be central, quietly turned into something forbidden. Later, as the house settled into evening, Mrs. Hartley lay awake listening to the ordinary sounds of old walls and winter pipes. Then she heard it. Footsteps, slow, measured, ascending, not on the servants' stairs outside her door, but somewhere deeper, more hollow. The sound rose, paused, then descended into silence. Mrs. Hartley did not move. In Roseford, she had learned that when people insisted something was never used, it was often because they hoped no one would notice when it was. And whatever walked that staircase at night was not meant to be seen. By morning, Mrs. Hartley knew one thing with certainty. The staircase everyone avoided was already shaping the fate of everyone in the house.
Chapter 2. Footsteps that refused to settle. Morning arrived in Roseford without enthusiasm. The sky remained the color of old pewter, and the frost along the hedgerows had not yet surrendered to daylight. Inside Greyfriar House, the atmosphere was much the same, quiet, restrained, and faintly watchful. Mrs. Elowen Hartley descended the servants' staircase shortly after 8, her movements careful but unhurried. She preferred these early hours, when a house had not yet decided what version of itself it intended to present for the day. Breakfast was already laid in the smaller dining room. Mrs. Crane sat at the head of the table, her posture immaculate, her hands folded precisely beside her plate. Charles Crane occupied the seat nearest the window, nursing a cup of tea he appeared to have forgotten to drink. Harold Ventnor read the newspaper with exaggerated concentration. "Did you sleep comfortably, Mrs. Hartley?" Mrs. Crane asked, her voice bright in a way that suggested effort. "Quite comfortably, thank you. Old houses always have their little conversations at night." Mrs. Crane smiled, quickly, tightly. "Yes, beams settling, pipes, perfectly ordinary." Charles gave a short, humorless laugh. "If you call it ordinary to hear someone pacing a staircase no one uses." The newspaper rustled sharply as Ventnor folded it. "I heard nothing. Some people are too eager to invent drama where none exists." Mrs. Hartley buttered her toast, listening rather than speaking. She had learned long ago that denial, when offered too promptly, was often a form of confession. "And yet," she said mildly, "several people seem to have heard the same thing. Footsteps, I believe." Mrs. Crane reached for the teapot a fraction too quickly. "The servants are impressionable," she said, "and December does little to steady nerves. Still, it is curious when imaginations align so precisely." No one replied to that. After breakfast, Mrs. Crane excused herself to attend to correspondence. Ventnor disappeared into the study with his papers, and Charles announced, rather aggressively, that he was going to inspect the roof. Mrs. Hartley was left alone in the morning room with her knitting and the long view of the drive. She waited. Houses, like people, revealed themselves when they believed no one was paying attention. Mid-morning brought movement. Rose, the housemaid, passed the morning room twice in quick succession, glancing toward the entrance hall each time as though something to emerge from it. When she noticed Mrs. Hartley watching, she startled visibly. "Everything all right, my dear?" Mrs. Hartley asked, gently. Rose hesitated, then nodded too firmly. "Yes, miss, just drafts." "Drafts tend to move air, not feet." Rose swallowed. "I shouldn't say anything. Mrs. Dorkin says it's foolishness." "And yet?" Rose lowered her voice. "It wasn't just last night. It's been happening for days. Always after midnight. Slow, careful, like someone counting the steps."
"And always on the same staircase?" Rose whispered. "The big one, the Christmas one." Later that afternoon, Mrs. Hartley took a slow walk through the entrance hall under the pretense of admiring the decorations. The staircase loomed above her, festooned with holly and ribbon, candles still unlit. It was beautiful in the way ceremonial things often were, meant to be admired rather than used. She examined the steps closely. The wear was wrong, not centered, not random. The polish was heavier along one side, close to the wall. The banister bore the faint dull sheen of repeated contact, not recent, but habitual. Someone did use these stairs, just not when anyone was meant to see. That evening, as dusk settled early in Roseford, Mrs. Hartley retired sooner than expected, citing fatigue. In truth, she positioned herself exactly where she needed to be, seated in a chair near her bedroom door, knitting idle in her lap, the door left just slightly ajar. At 10, the house went dark. At 11, silence settled. Just after midnight, she heard it. One step, then another. Slow, deliberate, not hurried, not uncertain. Someone who knew the staircase well. The sound rose, paused, then descended again. Mrs. Hartley did not move. She did not open her door. She did not breathe more deeply than necessary. In Roseford, she had learned that people who wished to be unseen were rarely careless. The footsteps faded. The house returned to stillness. But something had shifted, because footsteps, she knew, were never the beginning of a mystery. They were the sign that someone believed the house itself was listening. And by morning, Mrs. Elowen Hartley intended to find out who had taught it to do so.
Chapter 3. The Garland That Sat Too High. Daylight altered Greyfriar House, but it did not soften it. The Christmas decorations, so charming by candlelight, appeared excessive in the morning, almost defensive. Garlands looped heavily along the staircase banister, their greenery dark against the oak, ribbons tied with care that bordered on obsession. Mrs. Elowen Hartley stood at the base of the stairs, studying them as one might study a face that smiled too much. Mrs. Crane joined her a moment later. "Rather cheerful, aren't they?" she said. Charles insisted. He thought the house needed it. "Yes," Mrs. Hartley replied. "Festivity can be reassuring." Mrs. Crane hesitated, then smiled. "We all need reassurance from time to time." They were joined by Judith Ashford shortly thereafter, young, bright-eyed, and already bored by the countryside. She bounded down the servants' staircase with the impatience of someone unused to waiting. "I don't see why no one uses these stairs," she said, nodding toward the grand staircase. "They're quite magnificent." "Magnificent things are often fragile," Mrs. Crane replied too quickly. Mrs. Hartley watched Judith step closer to the banister, her gaze drawn upward. "They do look safe enough, at least by daylight." Mrs. Hartley moved closer as well. It was then she noticed the garland. Halfway up the staircase, one length of greenery hung higher than the rest, not draped over the banister, but secured to something above it. A brass hook embedded into the wall, well out of casual reach. "That one," Mrs. Hartley said lightly. "How clever it was placed." Charles Crane appeared behind them, his expression unreadable. "I hung it myself, used the library steps." Mrs. Hartley inclined her head. "You must be very tall." Charles smiled thinly. "Tall enough." She climbed the first few steps with care, one hand resting on the banister. From this angle, the hook was obvious. The knot securing the garland was precise, functional rather than decorative. A working knot, not chosen for appearance.
Judith followed her part way up. "I tried to come up here last night," she said casually. "Thought I heard someone above me. Gave me the most dreadful feeling." "At what time?" Mrs. Hartley asked. "After midnight. I turned back. Silly, I suppose." "Silliness often keeps people alive," Mrs. Hartley said gently. By late afternoon, tension had crept into the house like damp through stone. Conversation stopped abruptly when others entered rooms. Mrs. Crane's composure frayed at the edges. Harold Ventnor remained closeted in the study, papers spreading like accusations across the desk. Dinner that evening was a strained affair. Voices were polite, smiles were thin, wine flowed more freely than usual. "I can't see why we're all tiptoeing," Charles said suddenly, his glass clinking too sharply against the table. "This house is bleeding money." Mrs. Crane's face went pale. "This is neither the time nor the place." "When is it ever?" Charles retorted. "We pretend everything is fine while the roof leaks and the accounts—" "Enough," Ventnor said quietly. The silence that followed was heavy and revealing. Later, Mrs. Hartley excused herself early. Once again, she did not go to bed. Just after midnight, she heard it. Footsteps. This time closer, not ascending the staircase, but moving along the upper corridor. She opened her door a fraction and watched a faint glow pass beneath it. A candle. The figure moved toward the servants' stairs and disappeared downward. Mrs. Hartley waited. Then, from the direction of the entrance hall, light bloomed, the landing lamp. Mrs. Hartley crossed her room and peered through the corridor window. The landing glowed steadily, shadows stretched and shifted along the staircase walls, the garlands swayed slightly, though no breeze stirred the house. No footsteps followed, no figure appeared. Someone had created the appearance of movement without moving at all. Mrs. Hartley returned to her chair slowly, heart steady, mind sharp. In Roseford, she had learned that hauntings were rarely meant to frighten the dead. They were meant to frighten the living into staying away, into not looking too closely, into believing what they were told. And someone in Greyfriar House was very invested in keeping others from seeing what truly happened on that staircase.
Chapter 4. A Fall No One Heard. The scream tore through Greyfriar House just after dawn. It cut cleanly through sleep and silence alike, sharp enough to jolt Mrs. Elowen Hartley upright before her mind had fully caught up with the sound. She reached for her shawl and stepped into the corridor, where doors were already opening and hurried footsteps echoed with unfamiliar urgency. "It's Mr. Ventnor," Rose cried, her voice breaking. "He's at the stairs." The household gathered in the entrance hall in a manner that was both chaotic and oddly restrained, as though everyone feared moving too close might make the scene real. Harold Ventnor lay at the foot of the grand staircase. His body had folded unnaturally, one arm flung outward, the other trapped beneath him. His face bore no expression of fear, only surprise, as if whatever had happened had come too quickly for comprehension. Charles Crane stood a step away, pale and rigid. Mrs. Crane did not move at all. Mrs. Hartley approached slowly, stopping well short of the body. She did not need to examine it closely. Experience had taught her what a broken neck looked like. "Has anyone touched him?" she asked quietly. "No," Mrs. Dorking replied. "I wouldn't allow it." "Good." The doctor arrived within half an hour, confirmed what they already knew, and shook his head gravely. "Instant," he said. "A tragic accident. Old houses, dark staircases. It happens more often than one would like." Mrs. Hartley listened without interrupting. Accidents, she knew, were the most convenient explanations of all.
One by one they were asked the same questions. Did you hear anything? Did you see anyone? Were you awake? The answers were identical. No, no, no. Not a sound, not a cry, not even the heavy thud of bodies striking wood and marble. Mrs. Hartley found that odd. She stood once more at the base of the staircase after the body had been removed. The decorations still hung in place, the garlands draped obediently, the ribbons unmoved. The stairs themselves bore no signs of chaos, no scuffed slippers, no scraped wood, no grasped banister. A man falling instinctively reached for something, anything. Harold Ventnor apparently had not. That afternoon, while the house retreated into quiet shock, Mrs. Hartley climbed the staircase herself, slowly, carefully. At the landing she paused. The lamp stood exactly where it would cast light downward without illuminating the face of anyone standing beside it. The banister in one particular section was polished more brightly than the rest, not newly cleaned, handled, repeatedly. She ran her fingers along it, feeling the smoothness worn by time and touch. Someone had stood here often, watching. That evening, Mrs. Crane remained in her room claiming exhaustion. Charles disappeared into the study with a bottle of whiskey. The servants moved as though afraid of making noise. Mrs. Hartley sat by the fire, knit untouched in her lap. After midnight, she heard it again. Not footsteps this time, a door, softly opening. She rose quietly and watched from the shadows as a candle's glow moved along the corridor. Mrs. Crane. The older woman descended the servants' stairs, crossed the entrance hall, and stopped at the foot of the grand staircase. The landing light flared to life. Mrs. Crane stared upward for a long moment, then began to climb, step by step, carefully, as though retracing something she could not escape. At the landing she stood exactly where the banister was most worn. She leaned forward, looked down, and whispered, barely audibly, "I'm sorry." Then she descended and disappeared once more. Mrs. Hartley remained where she was, heart steady, mind racing, because sorrow returned people to places of grief, but guilt returned people to places of truth. And the staircase had not claimed a victim by chance. It had been used. Chapter 5. What the Lamp Revealed. By afternoon, Greyfriar House had fallen into a careful sort of order. Not the ease of routine, but the brittle calm that followed disruption, when furniture remained in place but meaning had shifted. Voices stayed low. Doors were closed more often than usual. The staircase stood untouched, garlands still in place, as though no one wished to remind it of its role. Mrs. Elowen Hartley sat in the morning room, a cup of tea cooling slowly at her elbow. She had not touched it. Her attention was fixed instead on the ledger Inspector Hale had placed before her on the table. "It was found in the study," he said, "behind the false panel of the writing desk." Mrs. Hartley turned a page with care. The book was old, but meticulously kept. Columns of figures marched down each page in disciplined lines. Payments, dates, initials, no explanations, no commentary, just repetition. Fear, she thought, often preferred neat handwriting. "These entries go back years," the inspector continued, "long before the house began to decline." "Yes," Mrs. Hartley replied, "and long before Harold Ventnor appeared to lose his footing." She paused at a particular page. The sums increased sharply halfway through the book, not gradually, but abruptly, like a threat escalating once its power was confirmed. Mrs. Hartley looked up. Did Mr. Venter manage the household finances? He advised, Inspector Hale said. Nothing official, but he was involved. Conveniently, she murmured. Mrs. Crane entered quietly and took the chair opposite, her face drawn, her hands folded too tightly together. I've told you everything I know. We were struggling. Harold helped, that is all. Mrs. Hartley regarded her with gentle attentiveness. Help often comes with conditions. Mrs. Crane looked away. Mrs. Hartley returned her attention to the ledger. Several entries were marked with a faint pencil dot in the margin, almost invisible unless one looked closely. Someone wanted these particular payments remembered or noticed, she said. Blackmail? Inspector Hale asked. Or leverage, which lasts longer. She closed the book carefully. May I ask, she continued, why the landing lamp was turned on last night? Mrs. Crane's breath caught, just slightly. I couldn't sleep. I went down for water. And turned on a lamp placed to illuminate the stairs, but not the person standing there? Silence stretched. Inspector Hale shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Hartley's voice remained mild. You were not looking to light your way. You were looking to see. Mrs. Crane's composure cracked, not dramatically, but enough. Her shoulders sagged. I wanted to know, she said quietly, whether it would happen again. What? The inspector asked. The footsteps, she said. The nights Harold climbed those stairs, watching, waiting, reminding us that he knew everything. Mrs. Hartley nodded slowly. And when he fell, Mrs. Crane continued, I thought perhaps it was finally over. Mrs. Hartley folded her hands. But people who fall accidentally leave disorder behind, and Harold Venter left none. Inspector Hale closed his notebook. You believe someone else was there? Yes, Mrs. Hartley replied. Someone who knew when to light the stairs, someone who knew exactly where to stand. She rose and crossed to the window overlooking the drive. Snow had begun to fall again, lightly this time, covering tracks with quiet efficiency. The staircase did not betray Mr. Venter. Someone guided it to it. Behind her, the ledger lay closed, but its meaning remained open, because whatever had pushed Harold Venter into the light had not done so out of panic. It had been done deliberately, and that meant the truth was no longer hidden in the dark, but waiting, very patiently, to be spoken.
Mrs. Hartley understood now. The staircase had not caused the fall. It had been prepared for it. Chapter 6. Traces Left in Passing. Greyfriar House grew quieter as the day wore on. Not the restful quiet of a country home, but the wary silence of people who feared that sound itself might betray them. The servants moved with exaggerated care, closing doors gently, pausing before speaking. Even the clock in the hall seemed reluctant to announce the hour. Mrs. Elowen Hartley had declined luncheon. Instead, she asked Inspector Hale if she might walk through the house once more, slowly and without company. He agreed, with the resigned air of a man who had already learned that refusal would serve no purpose. She began where she always did when matters grew unclear, at the edges. The upper corridor was narrow and dim, its windows overlooking the frozen gardens. Here the carpet runner bore faint signs of wear, not enough to draw notice, but enough to suggest frequent pacing. Mrs. Hartley stopped and crouched with care, brushing her fingers lightly along the edge. The fibers lay pressed in one direction only, back and forth, waiting. She straightened and continued on. Near the turn in the corridor, just before the servants' stairs, she paused again. Something small lay caught against the skirting board. She bent and lifted it between thumb and forefinger. A fragment of greenery. Not holly, not ivy. Pine.
She wrapped it carefully in her handkerchief and continued. The servants' staircase itself was unremarkable, plain wood, worn smooth by decades of honest use. But at the bottom, where it met the entrance hall, she noticed a faint scuff along the wall, no higher than a man's shoulder. A mark made in passing, or resistance. Mrs. Hartley returned to the grand staircase. Up close, the garlands revealed more than decoration. The greenery had been replaced in places, threaded carefully back into position, as though someone had taken pains to restore appearances. Too much care. She stepped onto the first step and climbed slowly. Halfway up, she stopped. There, on the edge of one step, was a faint indentation, shallow but distinct, the sort left by a shoe pressed hard, not downward, but sideways. She did not need to imagine the movement. Someone had stumbled here, or been steadied. At the landing, the banister gleamed dully in the afternoon light. Mrs. Hartley placed her hand where the polish was deepest and closed her eyes briefly. The picture assembled itself. The lamp, the timing, the quiet persuasion of authority. "Careful, Harold," someone would have said. "Let me help you." People trusted familiar voices. They trusted the illusion of safety. Mrs. Hartley descended and returned to the morning room where Inspector Hale waited. She placed the pine needle fragment on the table between them. This was found far from the tree, and yet it matches the garland exactly. He frowned, so he brushed against it before he fell. Or after, if he was moved, or guided. You're suggesting he did not lose his footing. I'm suggesting he did not fall alone. Inspector Hale exhaled slowly. Then whoever was with him knew the house, knew the light, knew when no one would hear. Yes, Mrs. Hartley agreed, and they believed the staircase itself would accept the blame. Outside, the snow thickened, blurring the boundaries of the garden paths. Inside, the truth was sharpening. Because accidents left chaos behind, this had left intention. And intention, Mrs. Hartley knew, always left one thing its author could not fully erase, a trace of themselves lingering where they believed no one would look. Someone in Greyfriar House had touched the staircase too often, too carefully, and in doing so had left behind the final proof that the fall was never meant to be a fall at all. Chapter 7. What Silence Was Hiding. The drawing room had been rearranged. Not noticeably, at least not to anyone unfamiliar with the house, but Mrs. Elowen Hartley felt the difference at once. Chairs had been drawn a little closer together. The fire burned higher than necessary. The curtains were half drawn, though the afternoon light had not yet faded. It was the arrangement people chose when they expected difficult conversation. Inspector Hale stood near the mantel, his notebook closed at last. Mrs. Crane sat upright on the sofa, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed somewhere just beyond the fire. Charles Crane leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, his weight resting unevenly on one foot. Judith Ashford had been asked to remain as well, though no one explained why. Mrs. Hartley took the chair nearest the window. For a moment, no one spoke. "People often believe," Mrs. Hartley said at last, "that silence protects them, that if enough things are left unsaid, the truth will grow tired and go away." Mrs. Crane's lips tightened. "But silence," Mrs. Hartley continued gently, "is rarely empty. It fills itself with meaning." Inspector Hale nodded. "We've established that Harold Ventnor did not fall by accident." Judith inhaled sharply, then stilled herself. The staircase was prepared, the light, the garlands, the timing. Someone ensured he would climb it, and ensured no one would hear. Charles laughed once harshly. "You make it sound like a performance." "In a sense, it was," Mrs. Hartley said. She turned toward Mrs. Crane. "You knew Harold went there at night." Mrs. Crane did not deny it. "He liked to remind us," she said quietly, "of what he controlled." "And you feared him," Mrs. Hartley said. "Yes." Mrs. Hartley inclined her head. "Fear explains much, but it does not explain everything." She shifted her attention to Charles. "You knew the house was failing financially. You knew Harold controlled the records, and you knew your mother would never expose him." Charles's jaw tightened. "He threatened us," Charles said, "threatened to sell the house out from under us." "And you believed the staircase would frighten him," Mrs. Hartley said softly. "The lights, the footsteps, the suggestion that the house itself was unsettled." Judith spoke before she could stop herself. "You're saying it was meant to scare him?" "Yes," Mrs. Hartley replied, "at first." Inspector Hale watched Charles closely. But something changed. Charles's gaze dropped to the floor. Mrs. Hartley's voice remained calm. "He climbed the stairs when he was not meant to. He argued. He resisted help." Her eyes met his. "And you were closer than you intended to be." The room felt smaller. "I didn't push him. I only reached for him." "And he lost his balance," Inspector Hale said. "Yes," Charles whispered. Mrs. Crane closed her eyes. "But you didn't call for help," Mrs. Hartley said. "You turned on the lamp instead." Charles swallowed. "I thought if it looked like an accident, it would be kinder," Mrs. Hartley finished. "That is often how people justify terrible decisions." Silence fell again. Judith stood abruptly. "And the footsteps?" she demanded. "The lights? That wasn't Charles." "No," Mrs. Hartley said. "That was you." Judith froze. "You moved through the house at night. You understood how suggestion worked. You helped create the story everyone was meant to believe." Judith's shoulders sagged. "I thought I was helping. I thought if people were afraid, they wouldn't ask questions." Mrs. Hartley regarded her kindly. "But fear does not erase truth. It only delays it." Inspector Hale straightened. "So the fall was not planned, but the deception was." "Yes," Mrs. Hartley replied, "and that distinction matters." Outside, the light had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the frost-bright lawn. Inside, the truth lay bare at last, not dramatic, not cruel, but heavy with consequence. Mrs. Hartley rose slowly. "In Roseford, we learn early that houses remember what people try to forget, and sooner or later they insist on being heard." No one contradicted her, because there was nothing left to deny. The truth had been spoken at last, but one question remained quietly unanswered. What would become of those who had lived with it for so long? Chapter 8. When the Truth Settled. The house did not resist the truth once it had been spoken. Greyfriar House seemed almost relieved, as though the weight it had carried through the winter nights had finally been set down. The fire burned lower, the corridors echoed less. Even the staircase appeared diminished, its decorations now faintly excessive, its importance reduced to wood and stone once more. Inspector Hale completed his notebook in the study, while arrangements were made quietly and without fuss. There were no raised voices, no dramatic protestations, only the slow acceptance that followed decisions made too late to undo. Charles Crane stood near the window, staring out across the snow-bright lawn. He did not look toward his mother. "I never meant for him to die," he said at last. Mrs. Elowen Hartley, seated nearby, did not contradict him. Intent, she knew, was rarely as clean as people wished it to be. "You meant to frighten him," she said gently, "and when fear became something else, you chose not to see it." Charles nodded once. Mrs. Crane remained very still. "I taught him to protect this house," she said quietly. "I never imagined it would ask that price." "Houses," Mrs. Hartley replied, "ask only what people are willing to give." Inspector Hale closed his notebook. "The law will take its course," he said. "There will be allowances made for fear, for circumstance, but not for concealment." Judith Ashford stood near the doorway, pale and exhausted. "I thought I was helping," she said. "I thought if everyone believed the house was unsettled, they wouldn't look too closely." Mrs. Hartley met her gaze. "Stories can protect us," she said, "but they can also trap us inside them." By late afternoon, arrangements were complete. The body had been removed, statements taken, decisions deferred to another day. Snow continued to fall, softening the edges of the drive and the path beyond the gates. Mrs. Hartley prepared to leave before dusk. She disliked lingering after matters had concluded. Endings, she believed, were best left undisturbed. Mrs. Crane walked with her to the door. "You saw it long before the rest of us, didn't you?" she said quietly. Mrs. Hartley paused, drawing on her gloves. "I saw that the staircase was being asked to carry a burden it did not deserve, and that someone hoped it would do so silently." Mrs. Crane nodded. "I suppose it's fitting," she said, "that the truth came down the stairs after all." Outside, the taxi waited. As Mrs. Hartley stepped away, she glanced once more at the entrance hall. The garlands still hung along the banister, but they no longer seemed festive, only unnecessary. The house would be quieter now, not because it was empty of secrets, but because those secrets had finally been named. And that, Mrs. Hartley knew, was the only way peace ever truly returned. As the car carried her back toward Roseford, Mrs. Hartley reflected that while justice had been done, its echo would linger, for houses forget slowly, and people even more so. Epilogue. After the decorations came down. Winter loosened its hold on Roseford gradually, as it always did. Snow retreated from hedgerows in uneven patches, and the lanes returned to their familiar muddle of footprints and bicycle tracks. Life resumed, not unchanged, but steadied. Greyfriar House was quieter now. The garlands had been taken down and packed away, their ribbons smoothed and folded with unnecessary care. The grand staircase stood bare once more, its banister unadorned, its steps plain and unremarkable. Without the weight of expectation, it looked almost ordinary. Perhaps it always had been. Mrs. Elowen Hartley returned to Roseford with a sense of completion she did not often allow herself. Mysteries, she had learned, rarely ended neatly. They faded instead, leaving behind a residue of understanding rather than triumph. She resumed her routines without ceremony: morning walks, afternoon knitting, quiet conversations at the village shop. The world did not require explanation for her absence, nor did it ask for an account of her return. One afternoon, while sorting post by the fire, she received a short note. It was written in a careful hand, the paper heavy. "Thank you for seeing what we could not," it read. "The house is being sold. Perhaps that is for the best." Mrs. Hartley folded the note and placed it in the drawer beside her chair. Some things were not meant to be kept close, only acknowledged. Outside, the church bells rang for the evening hour, their sound familiar and untroubled. Mrs. Hartley picked up her knitting at last, the needles clicking softly as the pattern emerged, steady, reliable, forgiving of small mistakes. In Roseford, stories were rarely spoken of directly. They passed instead through pauses in conversation, through glances exchanged over teacups, through the careful way people avoided certain topics while understanding them perfectly well. The staircase at Greyfriar House would, in time, become nothing more than a memory, a place people once avoided without quite remembering why. But Mrs. Hartley would remember. She always did. Because when silence lifted and truth was finally spoken, it left behind something quieter still, not peace exactly, but the possibility of it. And for Mrs. Elowen Hartley, sitting by her fire as evening settled gently over Roseford, that was enough. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me. If Mrs. Elowen Hartley's story stayed with you, if you found yourself listening a little more closely or noticing the smaller details, I'm glad you were here. If you enjoyed gentle mysteries, thoughtful clues, and stories where the truth reveals itself slowly, consider subscribing to the channel. New stories arrive regularly, each one meant to keep you company for a while. You're always welcome to leave a comment, tell me where you're listening from, or what kind of mystery you'd like to hear next. I read every note, and many of these stories begin with your ideas. Until next time, take care of yourself, keep an eye on the quiet details, and I'll see you again soon.